Hello there. Hello, Shelley. Hello, and Barry. Hello. Sorry, I was a little distracted there for a moment. Welcome to you all. James, hello. Welcome back. Um, Here we are again in the glorious rehearsal studio provided to us by WQED, where we are currently rehearsing Endgame. Indeed, I am committing the ultimate crime of sitting on a prop, and, the chair for Ham in Endgame. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes just for the latecomers because we know there are always a few. In the meantime, thank you, as usual, to the Allegheny Foundation, who have magnificently sponsored this year's webinars as they did last year. It makes all the difference to us. So thank you to them for the generosity of their sponsorship. It does cost money to produce these webinars, but never to you. They are always going to be free of charge. But you can make a donation. You can visit our website. Spring Appeal is still active and will be for another month or so. And we do have a target to reach. We need to raise $50,000. And so everything that you send, everything and anything, really makes a huge difference to us. And we hope that you will find it in your heart and in your wallet or your pocketbook to send us something. And no matter where you are, whether you're in the States, whether you're anywhere else. Hello, Grace. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Do think about sending a donation. It doesn't matter it matters if it's too small, but any donation helps. And you can send it in dollars, in euros, in pounds sterling, in Australian, Canadian dollars, in bahts, in whatever you've got. Please, I'll even take rubles. But do consider making a donation. You can go to the website, which is www.pigtheatre.org. You can find a donation button. You'll find donation buttons all over the website. Just press one, send us a few dollars. It makes a huge difference. And remember, it's your donations that put the productions on the stage. We have grants to cover administration. We even have a grant to cover the webinars, but we need your dollars to put the plays onto the stage. So please, please do think about sending a few dollars our way. And if you want to become a sustaining supporter, you want to make it a regular monthly payment, we can arrange that as well, because that's a really useful way to help us put the plays on the stage. Okay, so time is by. No, we'll give it another minute. We're okay. I do hope, I hope it's as lovely a day where you are as it is here today in Pittsburgh. It's a beautiful clear sky, the sun is shining, the temperature is quite pleasant, and all is right with the world. And in fact, the Pittsburgh Marathon takes place in 2 days' time. And I think it's going to be quite mild for that for a change as well. Not that I'll be running in it. And also just to let you know, and I'll remind you at the end, Endgame is coming up, May 12th, that will open. And that's deep in rehearsal now, as I say, here in the rehearsal studio. Next, also coming up is our next Expand the Canon series play reading, which is A Bold Stroke for a Wife. There you have it there, which is going to be a lot of fun. And I hope that for those of you in the Pittsburgh area, just as I hope you can get to see Endgame, I sincerely hope you can get to see Bold Stroke for a Wife. That will be, as it is with the other plays in our Expand the Canon series being presented at Rodef. It is free of charge, but you do need to book to make sure you actually get a seat, because we do have limited seating. So please make sure that you book early. Hello, Debbie. And the same with Endgame. Book now, because tickets are selling ferociously fast. It's already booked out pretty much for the opening weekend, and we want to be sure you see it. It is restricted seating, and it is a short run. So if you want to see Endgame, and I do say you do want to see Endgame, it's going to be wonderful. Do get online and book now. And I think that's about it for the preamble. And I want to talk a lot about Richard II today. We talked about him last week. We talked about the play as a work of, shall we say, creative genius, not completely in line with the truth. And I gave you a bit of background on the historic Richard and the theatrical Richard, and they are slightly different. But Shakespeare being a genius, didn't completely rewrite the nature of Richard's character. He took traits of it in order to create a play, to use drama, to use theatre as a way of demonstrating human behavior. And he took a historical figure. Now, he took several historical figures out of English history. In fact, what we know as the history cycle, a sequence of plays all the way from Richard II through to Richard III, covering a series of British monarchs reign by reign as one followed on the other. The only one not mentioned in there is Edward IV, but he's actually involved in the Henry VI plays. But Shakespeare took this entire cycle. However, there was one other history play, by the way, King John, which was much, much earlier and not to do with this particular cycle. But what Shakespeare was doing was examining the power, I suppose, monarchy, power, authority, and the stupidity of all of it, and of war. But he didn't write them in that sequence. What's always I find fascinating is, and you can tell by the texture of the plays, that you would imagine Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Richard III. You'd think that would be the natural cycle. He didn't write it that way. The first cycle was in his earlier writing period, and that's when he wrote Henry VI, Part 1, 2, and 3, although he didn't even write them in that order. He wrote Henry IV, Part 2, Henry IV, Part 3, and then Henry IV, Part 1. He didn't call them that. Later editors called them that. And he followed that with Richard III. And all these plays were written from around 1591, 1592. He possibly wrote Richard III slightly later in 1594. That was the first cycle. He then wrote the second cycle, which was the earlier historically. And it was in a period where his writing had changed. In the period that he was writing Romeo and Juliet, in the period he was writing Merchant of Venice and As You Like It, highly poetic pieces, particularly Romeo and Juliet and As You Like It, but also Merchant of Venice in its own way. And in that period, he went back to the beginning of what we now call the Henriade and wrote Richard II, Henry IV, 1 and 2, and Henry V. And they were written between 1595, 1599, around that period, all still within the period of the reign of Elizabeth I. Now, as I say, this second cycle, which was the first part of the actual historical cycle, was written in what one might say was a period where he was developing his sensitivity to the use of verse in telling a story. He could write verse like nobody, but in the process of telling the story. And as I mentioned last week, one of the interesting things about Richard III is that it is written entirely in verse. And that in itself tells you a story about what the nature of the characters were and what the nature of the play was. Verse has a way of romanticizing, of emphasizing. Something about verse, I mean, we know it in all of us who've studied poetry from an early age. We understand that the rhythms and the rhymes and the structures of our poem can tell us a lot about what the poem is describing, or what the experience of the poem is going to be. It's not simply the words, but very often the use of rhythm, very often the use of rhyme. So poetry in itself is a mechanism of writing, and certainly romanticizing and emphasizing were very much, I think, in Shakespeare's mind when he was writing this play. And of course, remember, everything I tell you may be wrong. It's all my opinion. That's all there is. So before we get to the main protagonist, and I want to do a thing of contrasting the two main male characters in this play, Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke, because fundamentally the play is about the transfer, not so peaceful transfer of power between King Richard and Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes King Henry IV. But before we get to those, I want to look at a little bit about the use of verse in that concept of romanticizing and emphasizing. And it's in the mouth of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt, father of Henry Bolingbroke. John of Gaunt of the line of Lancaster. They're all Plantagenets, but they're of different lines. And his was the House of Lancaster. There is also the House of York. And much later in the cycle, the House of Lancaster and York finally go to war with one another in what we call the Wars of the Roses, right through the Henry VI cycle. So John of Gaunt, a very important figure, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, and a fierce patriot, a man who believes in England and devoutly believes in England. And as I say, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, but he is dying. And a force of circumstances within the play has caused his son to be banished, and Richard, the king, is not what one might describe as an ideal monarch. The man is a poet, the man is an artist, the man is delicate, the man is not a soldier, not a warrior, not a governor, has very different attitude to the way that a country should be run. And John of Gaunt, and these are his, literally on his deathbed, Shakespeare puts into the mouth of John of Gaunt a dying speech, and a speech therefore where the speaker feels free to express his true feelings. Is that, that final moment before it all comes and you go for your eternal reward, that you can finally speak the truth, because there's nothing anybody can do about it. You're about to die. And John of Gaunt does this. Shakespeare puts into his mouth a very brilliant piece of work. It is beautiful poetry, and it is also a deeply political speech. And the verse is used to emphasize the message it contains. John of Gaunt says himself, "Methinks I am a prophet new inspired, and thus expiring do foretell of him. His rash fierce blaze of riot cannot last, for violent fires soon burn out themselves. Small showers last long, but sudden storms are short." It's a wonderful use of words and rhythm and emphasis to describe, to prepare us for what is to come later in the speech. Who is this he, and what has he done? And what has he done to what? What he's done to is England. But John of Gaunt, Shakespeare, doesn't simply say it's England. He describes it, and it is a very famous description. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise. Look at that, this seat of Mars, the war god, this other Eden, the Garden of Eden. The only second to it is England. This fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves in it the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. He's really laying it on with a trowel. England is wonderful. And the fact that it's an island, it is not only wonderful, it is special and sacred and blessed. This blessed plot, he goes on, this earth, this realm, this England. So Shakespeare has used verse rather magically to build up this notion of a place that is God endowed, God blessed, something special, so over and above anything else. And he's done it by using verse. But then he changes the tone, and again the verse does it. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life, How happy then were my ensuing death. And this is Shakespeare at his most clever. To use verse deliberately, to build up this wonderful, exquisite, beautiful image of a place that is beyond anywhere else on earth, perfection, this other Eden. And then without changing a beat, without changing the rhythm, without changing the meter, describes it as a place that is rotting from within, that is made shameful conquest of itself. That even though we had this wonderful wall around it of the sea, nobody could invade, nobody could see it. Remember, England had not been successfully invaded for, at that point, 450 years since the Norman conquest. So England was safe, but England was conquered from within. It is a brilliant, brilliant usage of verse to describe the internal rot and decline of any nation, a nation that conquers itself by bad judgment. You might almost describe that as the perfect speech to describe Brexit or any other country that is allowing itself to rot from within. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to emphasize with regard to this play and why I described it as my favorite of the histories. It is the use of verse, the use of language. I perish to suggest the thought, no acting required, but in fact within the words is a very clear picture of the characters in the way they speak, in the usage of language which Shakespeare has given them. If we look at Bolingbroke, as I say, who will eventually become Henry IV, when we meet him, he's presented as a heroic figure. Very much in the way that when we first meet Henry V in the play Henry V, who was, of course, the son of Henry IV. But Henry IV, Bolingbroke here is presented very much as a heroic figure, a man of decency, of probity, a man who is a force to be reckoned with. Not the kind of person who will sit and ponder and think and work out and worry, but the man who sees what a problem is, looks at it with great care, makes a decision and acts on it. And it's clear in the way he speaks. His attitude to offenders is as no-nonsense as the way he speaks. It's no-nonsense verse. His words are pointed, his words are crisp, but the use of verse gives them a particular authority. Let's listen, Michael is going to read a speech of Bolingbroke's for us.
Bring forth these men. Bushy and green. I will not vex your souls, since presently your souls must part your bodies, with too much urging your pernicious lives, for 'twere no charity. Yet, to wash your blood from off my hands, here in the view of men I will unfold some causes of your death. You have misled a prince, a royal king, a happy gentleman in blood and lineaments, by you unhappied and disfigured clean. You have in manner with your sinful hours made a divorce betwixt his queen and him, broke the possession of a royal bed, and stained the beauty of a fair queen's cheeks with tears drawn from her eyes by your foul wrongs. Myself, a prince by fortune of my birth, near to the king in blood and near in love, till you did make him misinterpret me, have stooped my neck under your injuries, and sighed my English breath in foreign clouds, eating the bitter bread of banishment, whilst you have fed upon my signores, disparked my parks, and felled my forest woods. From mine own windows, torn my household coat, raised out my impress, leaving me no sign, save men's opinions and my living blood, to show the world I am a gentleman. This, and much more, much more than twice all this condemns you to death. See them delivered o'er to execution and the hand of death.
I adore that speech because it is a perfect example of what Bolingbroke begins as, which is, as I say, a man of probity, a man of decision, a man of authority, and a man who does not waste breath on words. He uses his words so precisely and with such clarity. He starts with what will happen. There's no pretense or deception. Bring forth these men, bushy and green. I will not vex your souls, since presently your souls must part your bodies. He doesn't leave them in any doubt. He's not going to jolly them along. He's not going to lead them down false trails of hope. He brings them in and says, you two, you're going to die, and I'll tell you why. And that is exactly what he does. A precise list of wrongdoings, precision in the list, an absolute list, an undeniable list, and using verse, using the structure of verse to delineate why you are going to die. I'm going to kill you. This is why I'm going to kill you. Do you understand why I'm going to kill you? Fine. Now I'm going to kill you. Because he ends with a simple command. This and much more than twice all this condemns you to the death. And then quite, not casually, but firmly, precisely, see them delivered over to execution and death. There is no question about it. In many ways, it's rather like you first see King Lear. The first thing that when King Lear walks onto the stage, the first thing he says is an order. Attend the lords of France and Burgundy, Gloucester. No messing, no question, absolute authority. And what Shakespeare gives Bolingbroke in this speech is a clear, precise image of absolute authority. He is king over what he commands. He doesn't question it, and nobody questions him. His words are very clear on the point. Now, compare this with the more florid use of verse in the mouth of King Richard. Richard is a poet. Richard is a much more had a completely different notion of kingship, not as a leader of men, but as a king by right, God-given. Listen to the way he actually greets his kingdom, the actual physical soil of his land. He's been away in Ireland. He's been leading a campaign. He comes back and he talks as if the earth itself were his subject to him. Shakespeare gives him, in his words, a divine authority over the very ground on which he walks. Here's Max reading this.
Needs must, I like it well. I weep for joy to stand upon my kingdom once again. Dear earth, I do salute thee with my hand, though rebels wound thee with their horses' hoofs. As a long-parted mother with her child plays fondly with her tears and smiles in meeting, so, weeping, smiling, greet I thee, my earth, and do thee favors with my royal hands. Feed not thy sovereign's foe, my gentle earth, nor with thy sweets comfort his ravenous sense, but let thy spiders, that suck up thy venom, and heavy-gated toads lie in their way, doing annoyance to the treacherous feet, which with usurping steps do trample thee. Yield stinging nettles to mine enemies, and when they from thy bosom pluck a flower, guard it, I pray thee, with a lurking adder, whose double tongue may with a mortal touch throw death upon thy sovereign's enemies. Mock not my senseless conjuration, lords. This earth shall have a feeling, and these stones shall prove armed soldiers ere her native king shall falter under foul rebellion's arms.
Now, this is a far more poetic use of imagery and verse than Bolingbroke would ever be heard speaking. This is a king of delicate senses, a poet, not a warrior. But also, when you examine what he says, you realize not only is he not a warrior, but he is a deluded king. I've described him as unfortunate, and the unfortunateness of Richard is he does not realize how stupid he is being. I mean, look at that. Dear Earth, I do salute thee with my hand. That he is of the belief that his touch is, he goes on to say it slightly later, I do thee favors with my royal hands. And then in the injunction that the earth, the stinging nettles, the plants, everything else should oppose his enemies, he would be far better off regrouping, recruiting more soldiers, and being ready to fight Bolingbroke. But no, this fundamental belief that because he says so, because he can draw down this wonderful poetic image of that England itself will rise up, the physical body of the ground itself will rise up against his enemies. He will go further down this line. But what is interesting is, in the way that Shakespeare structures it, compare Bolingbroke, a list of wrongs that must be dealt with and execution is the result. With Richard, yeah, people are against me, but don't worry because the stinging nettles will get them and all the little snakes and everything else. The earth itself will fight against them. No sense of reality, but that's no sense of reality translated into a verse structure that is almost compelling. We almost go with him. We almost think, what a romantic, beautiful image that is. The earth shall have a feeling, and these stones prove armed soldiers ere her native king shall falter under foul rebellion's arms. Boy, has he got a lesson to learn. The earth doesn't give a damn. The stones won't help. Only soldiers can fight soldiers. And this, add this to his fundamental belief in his divine right to rule, which is his second poetic mistake, because that is a very poetic concept, that you have, by the grace of God, the right to rule other people. People have been saying that for thousands of years. People said it when they wanted to rule kingdoms. They said it when they wanted to rule slaves. They have always said, but it is God, ordained by God, that this should be, that my race is greater than yours. My God is greater than yours. My color is better than yours. My faith is truer than yours. Always that thing is used. And in terms of the divine right of kings, which was something that Richard the Second most definitely believed in. Most kings did. Most kings still believed that, and it's still indeed part of the coronation ceremony when a British monarch is crowned, the putting on of the oil. Henry VIII believed it. Unfortunately, Charles I took it to extremes and ended up losing his head because of it. Anyway, we put it with Richard. Richard the poet, Richard the man with these wonderful romantic allusions to how he will retain his power because the very land itself will rise up against his enemies. Also, that it is by God's grace that he rules. And when you have those two put together, you've got a major problem. The problem that the person who should be facing reality isn't facing reality. The person who should be intervening by the use of soldiery and weapons and proper military process believes that divine intervention is a practical military strategy. And the example comes in a speech that Shakespeare gives Richard when the rest of his followers are a little bit concerned that they're not ready for a fight. Richard responds this way. Here's Max again.
Discomfortable cousin, know'st thou not that when the searching eye of heaven is hid behind the globe that lights the lower world, then thieves and robbers range abroad, unseen, in murders and in outrage, boldly here. But when from under this terrestrial ball he fires the proud tops of the eastern pines, and darts his light through every guilty hole, then murders, treason, and attested sins, the cloak of night being plucked from off their backs, stand bare and naked, trembling at themselves. So when this thief, this traitor, Bolingbroke, who all this while hath revelled in the night, whilst we were wandering with the Antipodes, shall see us rising in our throne the east, his treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but, self-affrighted, tremble at his sin. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown, God, for his Richard, hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Then, if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right.
Now, when you look at that, nobody can deny that is a beautiful speech. The language in it is glorious. The allusion that he puts forward at the beginning, that robbers and nasty people only come out at night when it's dark, but when the sun rises from under his terrestrial ball, he fires the proud tops of the eastern pines and darts his light through every guilty hole. Once the sun comes up, murderers and robbers and everything, people like Bolingbroke, rush for cover, hide away, stand bare and naked, trembling at themselves. It's a wonderful, wonderful image. He goes on, when this thief, this traitor Bolingbroke, who all the while has revelled in the night, will see us rising in our throne, the east. Us rising in our throne, the east. The sun rises in the east. He is comparing himself to the sun. He is becoming the sun god returning. This notion that the mere fact of his return will frighten Bolingbroke. His treasons will sit blushing in his face, not able to endure the sight of day, but self-affrighted tremble at his sin. This is self-delusion. But he believes it. He believes that because he is king, this will happen. Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord. Because I am God's chosen, I cannot be deposed. I cannot be removed. God is on my side. And with God on my side, I cannot be defeated, because when I rise like the sun, he'll run away. Even taking that point one step deludedly further, but then again, in a beautiful, the image that he paints is so gorgeous that you want to believe it. It's like the Arthurian legend, the story everybody wishes was true. For every man that Bolingbroke hath pressed to lift shrewd steel against our golden crown. Remember that word, our golden crown. God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. And if angels fight, weak men must fall, for heaven still guards the right. And again, that notion that I am chosen of God, therefore God will defend me. If Bolingbroke puts soldiers out, God will bring angels. I love that. God for every God, God for his Richard hath in heavenly pay a glorious angel. Now that can allude on two levels. The notion that anybody fights for me is in God's service and is an angel, and also that God himself will send angels to fight for me. But it is delusion. And yet Shakespeare does not have him speak nonsense. He has him speak gloriously beautiful, poetic imagery. Why is he doing this? That contrast between Bolingbroke, the plain-spoken soldier, and Richard, the foolish but beautifully articulated king. He does this all the time, even in defeat, because when the final conflict does come, God has not sent his angels. The vipers and the stinging nettles have not risen up. Richard has been defeated. But even in defeat, he will return to a poetic eulogy on himself and his kingship. He will still refer to those as the two fundamental points for which he and England were fighting: himself and his kingship, his crown. When they talk about let's get away, let's hide, let's escape, let's go, because the absolute has not happened, he is now in the state of absolute failure. He can't see the politics between. Once he has lost, something has burnt out. maybe God's faith in him, whatever. He won't run away. Here's Max reading another piece.
No matter where, of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves, of worms and epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills. And yet not so, for what can we bequeath, save our deposed bodies to the ground? Our lands, our lives, and all our Bolingbroke's, and nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable. And humored thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, ceremonious duty, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?
Now, that final question I'll come to in a moment, but it is the most significant in this point of development about Richard's faith and belief in the divine right of kings, because the man is in shock. He lost. God didn't come to help him. The army of angels never materialized. As I said, the nettles and the adders and the stones did not rise up against his enemies. What happened? Everything that he thought should happen because of his position as king didn't happen. And he is in a state of deep depression. Of comfort no man speak. Let's talk of graves and worms and epitaphs. Write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors and talk of wills. And yet not so, for what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground? Bolingbroke owns everything now. There is nothing we can call our own except the 6 feet of earth that we are given when we're buried. And he goes even further. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. And then he enumerates a list, rather like the list that Bolingbroke did earlier in the play when he was explaining why he was going to kill Bushy and Green. Here is a list of what happens to kings. The sad stories of the death of kings, deposed, slain in war, haunted by ghosts, poisoned by their wives, sleeping killed, all of them murdered. For within the hollow crown, the golden crown has become the hollow crown. The crown imperial, the crown of the king, the crown blessed by God, granted by God, has become the hollow crown. And it is not God that lives there. Death lives there. Within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. Scoffing his state grinning at his pomp, this realization that everything he thought he had and wasn't, and that death is simply waiting, allowing him to monarchize. I love that word, to monarchize, to behave like a king, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if his flesh were brass impregnable. And when the king is fooled into believing his absolute authority and absolute position and power, death comes with a little pin and bores through his castle wall, and poof, farewell, king. And that's when but everything done in the most exquisitely structured verse. And finally, using a perfect poetic image of reality that is unlike anything that went before with the way Richard spoke. This wonderful poetic structure to lead to a realization. Throw away tradition, respect tradition, form and ceremonious duty. You have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread, like you. In other words, I need to eat. I feel want. I need things. I taste grief. I suffer. I need friends. Enormous admission. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king? If I need to eat, if I feel want, if I taste grief, if I need friends, maybe I'm not a king. Maybe I got it wrong, because a king shouldn't need any of that. A king is the chosen of the Lord and should be absolute. Have I failed because I'm not a king? How can you say I am a king if I need all these things? This is where dependence upon a delusion, once that delusion is shattered, leaves you with nothing. And again, Shakespeare is demonstrating this rather beautifully and poetically. Look at the way at the end of fighting that Bolingbroke responds. Here's Michael again.
Noble lords, go to the rude ribs of that ancient castle. Through brazen trumpet send the breath of parley into his ruined ears, and thus deliver. Henry Bolingbroke on both his knees doth kiss King Richard's hand, and sends allegiance and true faith of heart to his most royal person. Hither come, even at his feet, to lay my arms and power, provided that my banishment repealed and lands restored again be freely granted. If not, I'll use the advantage of my power, and lay the summer's dust with the showers of blood rained from the wounds of slaughtered Englishmen. The which, how far off from the mind of Bolingbroke it is, such crimson tempest should bedrench the fresh green lap of fair King Richard's land. My stooping duty tenderly shall show. Signify as much while here we march upon the grassy carpet of this plain. Let's march without the noise of threatening drum, that from this castle's tattered battlements our fair appointments may well be perused. Methinks King Richard and myself should meet with no less terror than the elements of fire and water, when their thundering shock at meeting tears the cloudy cheeks of heaven. Be he the fire, I'll be the yielding water. The rage be his, whilst on the earth I rain my waters. On the earth, and not on him. See, King Richard doth himself appear, as doth the blushing, discontented sun from out the fiery portal of the east, when he perceives the envious clouds are bent to dim his glory and to stain the track of his bright passage to the Occident.
Look at the difference there. Here you have a man using wonderfully constructed poetic thought, but in a far more practical sense. Richard has gone into despair, and using, again, poetic structure, using rhyme and rhythm, using romantic notion, falls into despair. Bolingbroke, on the contrary, uses his verse to make a pledge, a two-sided pledge, but he uses verse to do it. On both, Henry Bolingbroke on both his knees doth kiss King Richard's hand, and sends allegiance and true faith of heart to his most royal person, acknowledging the royalty of Richard. Hither come, even at his feet, to lay my arms and power, provided that my banishment repeal. In other words, Bolingbroke is using verse. He's using verse in a structure that says, I am pledging allegiance to the king I have just defeated on one condition. Give me back my land. Give me back my property. Let my banishment be repealed. In other words, put me back to the way I was, and I will acknowledge you, king. I've just beaten you. I could take the crown. I am now in the position of victor. But he breaks that down, Shakespeare, in a verse structure so that we are absolutely crystal clear as to what the intentions of Bolingbroke should be. Because now Bolingbroke reveals something else. The fact that it's unlikely to be accepted, because there is a second side to it. If not, I'll use the advantage of my power and lay the summer's dust with showers of blood rained from the wounds of slaughtered Englishmen. Remember that notion. In other words, he's saying, if you don't want to do this, if you won't accept it, I will slaughter everyone in sight. The which, how far off from the mind of Bolingbroke it is, such crimson tempests should bedrench the fresh green lap of fair King Richard's land. In other words, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be forced to do this, but if I have to do it, by God, I'm going to do it. And then he goes to another poetically structured but very precise image, not flowery, not embellished, not like Richard's. Methink King Richard and myself should meet with no less terror than the elements of fire and water, when their thundering shock at meeting tears the cloudy cheeks of heaven. In other words, a storm. Be he the fire, I'll be the yielding water. The rage be his, whilst on the earth I rain my waters. On the earth, and not on him. Look at that, the structure of that. You are left with no doubt whatsoever, the political thinking. Richard rage, I will be the water. I will rain benefice. I will be the calm on the earth that Richard always treated as a subject. He won't be raining largesse on the king. He'll be raining largesse on the king's earth, the king's subjects. Brilliant political statement, something that Richard would never be capable of. Richard's response to this is still florid denial of reality. And again, his verse structure, poetics, the grandiloquent poetics of a deluded king. There is Bolingbroke saying, I will give everything if you just give me back everything I had. I will be your loyal subject if you just make that thing happen. Man to man, let's talk. Richard is incapable of talking man to man because deep down in his soul, Richard still believes he is God's anointed king. Let's listen to Richard's response. Here's Max again.
We are amazed, and thus long have we stood to watch the fearful bending of thy knee.
Hold on.
We are amazed, and thus long have we stood to watch the fearful bending of thy knee. because we thought ourselves the lawful king. And if we be, how dare thy joints forget to pay their awful duty to our presence? If we be not, show us the hand of God that hath dismissed us from our stewardship. For well we know, no hand of blood and bone can gripe the sacred handle from our scepter, unless he do profane, steal, or usurp. And though you think that all, as you have done, have torn their souls by turning them from us, and we are barren and bereft of friends, yet know, my Master, God omnipotent, is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence, and they shall strike your children yet unborn and unbegot, that lift your vassal hands against my head and threat the glory of my precious crown.
Poetic delusion upon poetic delusion. It's quite remarkable. We are amazed, and thus long have we stood to watch the fearful bending of thy knee. I'm waiting for you to kneel. I won't talk to you until you kneel. How dare thy joints forget to pay their awful duty to our presence? Awful. Shakespeare uses that word in its pure sense. Awful, worthy of awe, the way we should feel towards a king omnipotent. Show us the hand of God that hath dismissed us from our stewardship. For well we know no hand of blood and bone can gripe the sacred handle of our scepter, unless he do profane, steal, and usurp. Still thinking, beautiful images, but still totally deluded, still unable to accept human reality. And then that ultimate delusion, still the way he talked about the nulls and the adders and the stones rising up to fight, that there would be an army of angels coming on his side, still lost in the poetic delusion. God omnipotent is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence, and they shall strike your children yet unborn and unbegot. In other words, he's looking for the biblical plagues and waves of torment that was visited upon Egypt when Moses asked to let my people go. This absolute delusion, but done in such magnificent, overarching, poetic beauty. Not God's on my side and God's going to punish you, but God omnipotent is mustering in his clouds on our behalf armies of pestilence. This, even in final defeat, he can't quite pass it away. He can't quite escape from that notion that he is in some way not merely the servant of God, but the hand of God, the appointment of God. Even in utter defeat, he will fall back on this poetic imagery, this florid poetic imagery that elevates him somehow from being merely mortal. And in this next speech, which is the scene I mentioned last week, with the rather brilliant scene of the play, where we actually see the peaceful transfer of power, but it's not as peaceful as it might appear. You have a perfect example of the use of verse in its structure to demonstrate the motivation behind what the character is speaking. Here's Max again, and this is from the scene of abdication.
No, I, for I must nothing be. No, I, for I must nothing be. Therefore, no, for I resign to thee. Now mark me, how I will undo myself. I give this heavy weight from off my head, and this unwieldy scepter from my hand, the pride of kingly sway from out my heart. With mine own tears I wash away my balm. With mine own hands I give away my crown. With mine own tongue deny my sacred state. With mine own breath release all duty's rights. All pomp and majesty I do forswear. My manors, rents, revenues I forego. My acts, decrees, and statutes I deny. God pardon all oaths that are broke to me. God keep all vows unbroke that swear to thee. Make me that nothing have, with nothing grieved, and thou with all pleased that hast all achieved. Long mayst thou live in Richard's seat to sit, and soon lie Richard in an earthly pit. God save King Harry, King Richard says, and send him many years of sunshine days.
There you have it. What I love about that speech, here you have somebody saying, forced to abdicate. There's no question about it. He'd lost the war. He wouldn't come to terms. He wouldn't agree. He could have still been king. Bolingbroke said, I will do that. I'll be your loyal subject. All you have to do is promise to put me back to where I used to be. And Richard refuses because he is the king and ends up being forced by just everybody around him. Not only Bolingbroke supporter, but many of his own, you gotta go. It's that message that we send sometimes to leaders. Now is the time to say goodbye. And so he's forced to abdicate, but he does not abdicate in any way other than his own belief in his own divine authority. Mark me how I will undo myself. Not you're taking it away. I'm going to undo myself. I'm going to undo what I am to be something else. I give this heavy weight from off my head, this unwieldy scepter from my hand, the pride of kingly sway from out my heart. In other words, I am divesting myself of kingliness. With my own tears, I wash away my balm, the holy oil that's put on a king when he's crowned. My tears will wash that away. My hands give away the crown. With my tongue, I deny my sacred state. Sacred state. I am now saying I am no longer sacred. I'm saying it. I am stepping back. With my own breath, release all duty's rights. I am stepping down. You're not deposing me, because you cannot depose a deputy elected by the Lord. It was said in that earlier speech. You can't do it. Only I can do it because I am God's chosen. So I am agreeing to do this. All pomp and majesty I do forswear, all manors, rents, revenues I forgo. I'm giving it all away. I'm stopping. I'm walking away from it. God keep all vows unbroke that swear to thee. In other words, may God now be on your side. Make me that nothing have with nothing grieved, and thou with all pleased that thou hast achieved. In other words, Richard is doing the abdication. He's not being made to abdicate. He doesn't simply follow a script. He is the one who's making the choice to do it. It's quite remarkable. And that final phrase he has, God save King Harry, unkinged Richard says. Unkinged Richard. In other words, I am now not God's chosen. I've chosen not to be. I have passed that to you, because that's the only way it can happen. You can't take it. I have to give it. It's a remarkable and very poetic methodology, because the play goes on to other areas of Richard trying to work out who the hell he is and what the hell he is. Does Richard think his poetry is is stronger. Sorry, I'm trying to read this. Does Richard think his poetry is stronger than political military might? No, he believes that his kingliness is stronger than political and military might. He believes that the fact that he is the anointed, chosen of the Lord, makes him somehow magically invulnerable and all powerful, and that God will always support him, and that because he is God's choice, the very ground itself will rise up and protect him. That's the delusion. The delusion, the delusion of, it's the fundamental delusion of narcissism taken to its most extreme with power. Because I am the king, I am God's chosen. And we see that everywhere, in every way, in all aspects of governance and politics. We see it happening all the time. And only I can pass that on. Ordinary men cannot take it away. That's why I think he is the unfortunate king. Not because he was a bad man, but because he was an ineffectual king. Because what Shakespeare wanted us to see is that the trappings of power, the mythology of power, is not the same as the actuality of power. Richard, in Shakespeare's play, and very possibly in history as well, should have been what he was far better at, or far better suited for. Not a king, but a poet. Anyhow, that's all we're going to say about Richard II, although we may come back to him at a later point. A couple of quick notes, which is that coming up, as we said before, we are having another of our Expand the Canon series play readings called A Bold Stroke for a Wife. And next week, my associate producer, Sharon, will be having a conversation with Elena Alexandratos, who will be directing it, and they're going to be talking about this play. I do recommend you tuning in for this one, because it's a really interesting play. And I'm delighted that we're actually doing a reading of it. It's one of those classics that we would include in the program had we but world enough and time and money. Speaking of which, don't forget to send a donation. The thanks again to our Allegheny Foundation. Please make a donation. Visit the website. If you're watching on YouTube, because you couldn't see the live broadcast, you can still also make a donation. And I think that's all I have time for this week, because I'm back to rehearsal. So do join Sharon and Elena next week for Bold Stroke for a Wife, and I will see you very soon. Bless you. Bye.